Hello everybody, I'm Terry Ryder, founder of Hotspotting. Welcome to today's webinar and indeed welcome to 2023 because this is the first of our program of webinars that will roll out throughout the year ahead, and it does promise to be a momentous year in real estate, although not for the reasons you're seeing in mainstream media. I believe Australian property markets are bound with opportunities for real estate investors in 2023. But I won't expand on my reasons for believing that because our guest presenter today for this, our first webinar of the year, is someone who is better qualified than most in the real estate industry to have an opinion based on knowledge and experience at the coalface of the industry. Miriam Sandcooler of Property Mavens is a multi-award-winning buyer's advocate and a best-selling author. And she's here today to tell us what she thinks about real estate markets and what lies ahead in 2023. So Miriam, welcome.
Thanks, Terry. Lovely to be here. And yes, Happy New Year, even though it's February. First time I've said it to you this year.
Yes, well, I'm never sure how late is okay to say Happy New Year.
I think it stops in January, to be honest. I reckon we've got to the end of January, so we've broken the rule. Never mind. Okay.
So, Miriam, I know you'll probably touch on this as you work through your presentation, but I know your business is expanding, and that's a sign that things are good in real estate markets.
Yeah, absolutely. You would know that I have a franchise model. We're rolling out nationally. We've now got presence in Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria. We're certainly looking to recruit in Tasmania, South Australia and more franchisees in those areas as well as WA. So there's definitely opportunity there.
Yeah, sure. And it's an indication. I think there are many indications that I guess we'll talk through today that markets are, I think, a lot stronger and more prosperous than mainstream media with all the white noise that it indulges in would have us believe. And I think that's something we'll be dealing with today in your presentation. Absolutely.
And I do touch on being aware of the media as well, definitely.
Okay, definitely something that we do need to talk about.
Yeah. All right.
So over to you, and
fantastic. So everyone you can see my screen?
I can see it.
Excellent. So thank you for everyone joining us today. Obviously, we're going to talk about investor opportunities in 2023. As is usual, there's no personal, individual, tax, legal or property or financial advice being provided today. So it's always about seeking independent advice that's tailored to your own circumstances. Just touching on a little bit about who we are and what we do. So we are a multi-award winning industry recognised property advocacy agency. So our expertise is working with buyers and sellers of real estate. So with buyers, it's about providing that independent advice to help our clients find the right solution. And of course, we work with sellers doing vendor advocacy so they can transition into the next chapter of their lives. And pretty well, we're working with separating couples, deceased estates, downsizers, upgraders, relocators, first home buyers and investors. As you said, Terry, multi-award winning. So 22 award nominations there, finalist award nominations over the last 10 years, including REIV Buyers Agent of the Year recently. And for those who don't know me, I am a licensed real estate agent working as a buyer and vendor advocate. I'm an accredited property investment advisor, a best-selling author, a real estate media commentator, and recently I've been engaged as an expert witness against other buyer agents who actually don't know what they're doing and they're giving their clients really bad advice, unfortunately, and there's possibly a bit more of that to come. As I mentioned, we are expanding nationally and we're recruiting nationally. So if we've got anyone on the line, on the call today or the webinar today who's interested in investing outside of Victoria and into those other states, we can help you. Okay, so this is what we're going to go through today. So first and foremost, well, what's happening in the market? So we do know that many markets are less competitive before, and on the whole, buyers are having the upper hand in negotiations. And of course, that is subject to supply and demand. Rental vacancies across Australia are the lowest ever recorded. There are council crackdowns happening with Airbnbs, and I'll expand on that a little bit more. We've got demand for rentals expected to continue to rise with immigration, with approximately 200,000 immigrants coming in this year. And that's not just overseas immigration. We're talking about interstate immigration as well. So there is a bit of a trend happening at the moment where those people who might have exited out of somewhere like Victoria a couple of years ago at the beginning of COVID, some of them have gone to various places around the country. That lifestyle isn't necessarily agreeing with them. They made good money when they sold. They're now interstate. They have the potential to make good money when they sell, and then they're looking to potentially come back to wherever they left from. So there's two lots of migration happening there. And we really are in a crisis. When you look at the lowest ever recorded levels of rental vacancies in the country, it actually is a crisis. The amount of homelessness is increasing. People are living in cars and tents that we've never seen before. And there are many reasons that's happened, but certainly rents and yields are rising. And for some people who are in a position to invest, that is providing good compensation to offset those rising interest rates. And of course, we had another rate rise yesterday. So in Melbourne, listings are down 28% year on year for Melbourne compared to the same time last year. So that gives you an indication of where vendor and market sentiment is at. We have a mortgage cliff to come in that we've got a whole lot of people who would have fixed their interest rates 2 years ago that would have been significantly lower than they are today. They're about to come out of that 2-year fixed period. And for most of them, their repayments will literally double overnight. That may put people under pressure. It may mean that people are forced to sell, and it could mean that stock levels might rise. So it's a case of just seeing how that pans out in the next few months. Certainly alarmist media reporting. This is what Terry mentioned before. I was reading an article in the Herald Sun a couple of days ago where it said 2 of the big 4 banks are predicting that house prices are going to fall 11% this year, wiping approximately $100,000 from the value of homes. Now, that's a really big, broad, generic statement. We know there's not one single Australian market. Everything will come down to your local market, where you are, what suburb, where you are in the suburb, what the property type is, what the land value is, and what the supply and demand factors are, and that'll determine where your property's sitting. I do want to say part of the vacancies being tight, what's contributed to that as well, is that, or being so low, is that obviously a number of investors have gone and bought properties that they're now using for Airbnb. And whilst that's worked well for them, obviously in areas where we've had recent flooding and so forth, it's left quite a number of people homeless when those properties have needed to become available for the holiday season. One thing I will say that councils are more and more starting to crack down on that. So if you don't have a property that meets the planning regulations or the zoning regulation to run that type of property in that location, then the council may actually prevent you from doing that. Or in some cases, people are getting really steep rate hikes and they're basically paying 50% more on the rates for that particular property because of the use of it as an Airbnb than if it was just going to be rented residentially. And in some instances, you might say that's, you know, to encourage people to let property and make them available in the rental supply pool. And it's also, in some instances, protecting the hospitality and the hotel sector as well, because obviously hotels have to be compliant across multiple areas and there are significant costs involved in running them and running those types of businesses. And they employ a lot of people too. So, yeah, sorry, Terry.
And certainly in South West Queensland, there's actually quite a lot of action by councils in various ways against Airbnb issues. The Brisbane City Council has started charging much higher rates for people who have their rental property in the short-term pool. Both the Sunshine Coast Regional Council and the Noosa Council have taken action to try and restrict the use of Airbnb. But I think ultimately the Airbnb factor is only a minor component of the rental shortage. I mean, there are far bigger issues that have created that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely one part of it. And I know in WA, for example, particularly in the southwest of WA, it's pretty typical for people to buy houses there and use them as holiday homes. But there are whole areas that are zoned residential where technically those properties shouldn't be used for any purpose other than someone living there residentially full time. And councils can just come in at any point in time and go, that's it, the party's over. I mean, it would bring some properties back into the supply pool, but under no circumstances would it deal with the crisis that we're dealing with. So given those trends, the implications are it is a good time to buy. However, consider what I was just mentioning before. In terms of listings being down so low, it does mean you have to be particularly fussy and you might have to be patient for the right property with the right attributes to come along. But when it does, don't muck around, jump on the opportunity because they're scarce statistically compared to what they would have been 6-12 months ago. Bearing in mind every state's now got minimum rental standards. Victoria's got 14 minimum rental standards. I think Queensland's looking at bringing in about 8. New South Wales has sort of similarly had some come in. So if you are going to be investing in the market, familiarise yourself with what those rental standards are, because if you buy a property that isn't compliant, you will have to fork out money to make it compliant. How much money will depend on the property that you've bought, and often in some cases you can't rent that property until it's compliant. So if you're relying on getting trades or getting renovations done or works done of any significance, that property is going to sit there vacant costing you until it's compliant. So it's really important that you educate yourself about that. So the pros of buying now is, we've got an ever increasing interest rates. Generally, the higher the rates, the sort of more the market tends to pull back from a buying point of view. But what eventually we hope to have happen in the next 12 months, and off the top of my head, someone at CBA was talking about this recently, where eventually those rises will plateau, and then towards the end of the year, they're likely to decline. And like any time in the market, as soon as interest rates start declining, then home buyer and investor activity starts picking up again, which then has the effect of prices starting to increase.
Yeah.
So,
and Miriam, it's probably worth noting that a story that we'll be featuring this week through our social media channels is that there's evidence from one of the comparison websites that the big lenders are now starting to actually price in interest rates coming down.
Okay.
Around the middle of the year, so then they're now starting to bring down the interest rates that they're asking for various variable loans, but also in particular for the longer term fixed rates.
Right,
An indication that they see interest rates actually plateauing off and then coming down before the end of the year.
Great. Well, then that's a trigger for people to maybe have a little bit of confidence that now's not a bad time to invest.
Yeah.
Certainly, if you are going to invest now with these somewhat slightly higher interest rates, bear in mind they're not the highest they've ever been, and they're certainly not as high as they might have been 5-10 years ago. But you don't want to cash flow for the higher interest rates until they stop increasing and then they start to plateau. So just bear that in mind and cash flow accordingly. But like I said, be patient, know what to buy, where to buy it for your maximum return, make sure it's an A-grade property, make sure those minimum standards are met. I know in Victoria, if you've got one breach that you get prosecuted for, it's $20,000 per breach. And if you've got a property with multiple breaches, then you're going to pay multiple times that amount if you take them to VCAT. And like I said, if you need work done, tradies are expensive, hard to get, building materials are high. So try and buy properties that don't need anything. So if we have a look at some opportunities, Mornington Peninsula, you can see what's changed in the market in the last 12 months. So this year is actually a good one for buyers with a long-term view, particularly if they're wanting to buy in these bayside suburbs. We see great value in detached homes in specific suburbs and regional centres. So yes, you can see here St Andrews Beach has actually gone down by 10% in the last 12 months, but in the last 2 to 3 years, it's gone up by 46.9. So overall growth and then a little bit of softening. But again, once interest rates start to slow down, that should be reflected there as well. We've got mortgage stress, and you can see here that the different suburbs that I was just referring to before, the current levels of mortgage stress, then what's going to happen after 1-2 rate rises. So you can see little to no change in Dramana, slight change in Portsea, little to no change in St Andrews Beach, and similarly with Sorrento. But if you start looking at some of the metro suburbs like South Melbourne or Melbourne CBD or Docklands, you can see that, those rises do start to come in and bite a little bit. And there are significant numbers of properties where there are loans attached against it. So it would be fair to say that the higher the levels of mortgage stress in particular areas, the greater the potential for some of those properties to come and hit the market or sale if people can't service those debts. All right, so typically before buying, we want to look at those important considerations. If you've got a property strategy and it's driven by a financial planner, often they'll have theoretical outcomes they're wanting you to achieve. So you've got to make sure that they're aligned with reality in terms of yields and so forth. You want to make sure that your risk profile matches your investor profile when it comes to property. You want to consider the type. Is an apartment a house or a townhouse? As I said, in each of the states, they've got minimum rental standards that need to be met. And certainly those A grade properties are fewer, but better quality, high performance assets. And always be aware of cultural appeal. Depending on your background and what you're accustomed to at home, doesn't necessarily correlate to being a good investment in Australia. So you really need to educate yourself about the type of properties that home buyers are interested in buying here on a broader level, just to make sure you're not making any mistakes. And just generally, as always, you know, you're looking at macro and microeconomic indicators. Want to take a medium to long-term approach. You want to buy for multiple growth drivers in combination. You want minimum populations of 80,000, or that's my cutoff point. You want to check the days on market for stock, and you really, given the trauma that we've had in Australia over the last 2 to 3 years, you want to check for properties if they've been subjected to flooding, fire, drought. Drought, you'll see as evidence of cracking and movement in foundations and the properties themselves. So really do your research on those properties, because often in flooded areas, everyone forgets 12 months later, they go on to, a search engine, and all of a sudden they see a property that looks really cheap, and they totally have no awareness around the fact as to what happened previously with flooding. You want to make sure there's sufficient employment in the area so people don't have to travel. Of course, check your water, sewage, gas, power. Are there any off-grid costs if you're buying regionally, if you're wanting to do your tree change kind of thing? Is the quality and condition of the property what we call an A grade or a C grade property? And I'll show you a slide shortly. Understand what's going on with local amenity infrastructure, and then of course land supply. And Terry has access to reports that have all of that information taken into consideration within them. All right, so key considerations, again, I've referenced some of these, but it doesn't hurt to look at the price growth over the previous 5 to 10 years. Days on market, how long has that property been listed for? What are the average days on market for those areas? Have they increased over time or decreased? Again, supply, demand factors, growth drivers, multiple growth drivers for future growth. And of course, what are the unemployment levels like in the area? Are they low or are they high? So landlords want to be aware of that. Check the condition of the property. And of course, demographically, you want to consider the household age, income, occupancy type, and structure. So what to buy? Well, we're very much the opinion that livable units are very much a way to go at the moment. Many years ago, there was a massive oversupply of apartments. People struggled to rent them, people struggled to sell them. Then, of course, we had COVID. A lot of people were desperate to get out of their rental properties, and a lot of apartments were taken up, particularly those that were released into the market where international students weren't coming back anymore. So a lot of that stock's been taken up by first home buyers, as well as downsizers, as well as some investors. And now there's not as much stock as there was, and you still have to be incredibly fussy about what you buy. So you need to think of your target market tenant as well as your future buyer. You want to look at 2-bed apartments or villa units where they're at least 55 square metres. You want good amenity and open living floor plan, high build quality and good insulation, high owner occupancy blocks that are tightly held. Ideally, you want a balcony or an outdoor space, preferably. This was a really unique property I bought in a very tightly held building in Victoria. The balcony alone was 100 square metres. It was enormous. And again, where you can, you want to buy in a smaller building or complex of up to 40 units. You want a car space and storage on title. And ideally, you want to be looking at those inner and inner middle suburbs close to transport. So we know that there's been a push by local councils to build these types of properties in and around train stations and business centres within varying middle ring suburbs. They're not all great quality, but you want to make sure that you're buying, again, the right property with the right attributes. You want to make sure there are no building issues, and definitely check for things like combustible cladding, because properties that are even 10, 15 years still have those issues as well. Okay, so why these properties? Well, there's a shortage of what we call downsizer apartments in Melbourne. So last decade saw a building boom of what we call those small cookie cutter apartments that were basically spat out as investment stock. They're the ones that, often are a struggle to resell. But livable units are now in short supply. As I said, low stock levels are biting. Some investors are buying them for Airbnb. There is a rising demand for these units in the 2 to 3 bedroom sector, with high livability from first home buyers, downsizers, double income, no kids and singles. And we expect the gap between demand and what the industry is currently building to meet supply to continue to widen. So as we've got more and more people living in Australia and returning to Melbourne's lifestyle, these are very much the sort of properties that are going to be in demand. And certainly at the moment, SMSF rules have changed. So anyone who's 55 or older now, it used to be 60 or older, but if you're 55 or older, you've got a property worth X in the suburbs and you sell and downsize, then you have the capacity to tip 300,000 into your super. You get a tax advantage. You'll need to speak to a financial planner about that and get the details of it. But now there are more incentives for people to be selling their homes in the suburbs, downsizing, tipping money into super, and possibly doing, you know, a CBD apartment and then a tree change or sea change property on top of that as well.
Marion, could I just clarify when you said it's the gap between demand and what the industry is able to supply? You're saying there that demand is rising and supply is actually weakening.
Yeah. In terms of, you know, because we've had this crisis around building costs go up as well. And I remember blogging about it 3 or 4 years ago when we had the fires, and a lot of forests were burnt that were providing pine and timber for construction, you know, so to build timber frames and so forth. So it literally started back then, and that was always going to take a year or so to bite, because they had a year from when those fires started to harvest as much as the timber as they could. And then of course it's really slow to grow. So in terms of being able to replenish that timber that was used for structural building is going to take years in some cases. So that started the ball rolling with costs going up. But then of course with the incentives the government put out about, you know, everyone's going to get X thousands of dollars discount if they go and buy a brand new property or an off the plan property, and that created the building boom. And then of course we had issues with COVID and not enough supply of staff and tradies, and issues with access to materials from overseas, and it all just turned into a big fat mess. So
just another example of an issue created by politicians who don't think through the consequences of their decisions. They tend not to look beyond the press conference. So we've got builders going broke as an indirect consequence of the previous federal government's decisions. What I would like to say is that the trend you've identified there in Melbourne, I think that's a trend nationwide that we've detected with our research. Growing demand for quality apartments in good, well-located inner city areas. That's happening also in Brisbane and Sydney. And it's, you know, partly driven by affordability. People can't afford houses in those areas, but they can afford apartments. But it's also a lifestyle choice, and downsizes is a big part of it.
Absolutely. And, you know, we've got international students returning to TAFEs and universities. As I said, we've got other overseas migration and interstate migration. And certainly first home buyers in recent years have been getting their foot in the door into the property market by buying apartments. I mean, there might be a point in time where they need to upsize and upgrade and transition to the next level of a small house. But it's really imperative you're making the right decision in terms of what you're buying and where you're buying, and things you need to take into consideration. The other things to think about, if you do have a high risk profile, because this does entail high risk, potentially high costs, it is an issue of timing and you have to get funding, is buying sites with potential development to add housing to the supply. And so now more than ever, there's demand for that. Certainly we do buy sites with development potential for a lot of our clients. You know, this one in our deal we bought recently, which has the capacity to knock this house down and build 4 units on that site in a client's super fund. But, you know, it's understanding that there are different stages when you buy that kind of property. There are different things you're going to have to qualify for financially. There are different things you're going to have to pay out in terms of planning and applications and so forth. So it may not be for everyone to actually develop, but you may want to consider buying a site with that kind of potential. So like anything, it's really important about what you buy and where you buy it. So if we talk about where to buy, you know, I'll briefly touch on sort of Victoria and then I'll throw to you, Terry. But certainly what we're seeing in metro and regional areas, that, as I said, buying apartments in those inner middle ring suburbs is one thing. You can also in Victoria look at Ballarat, Bendigo and Geelong. I mean, you can see here that Ballarat compared to the rest of Victoria has a median price point of 476,000. It's continued to increase in the last 3 months as well as over the last 12 months. So there are regional markets where demand is still high, stock levels are low, We don't have the booming prices and the speed of the market that we had before, but if it's still an investment grade property, it's doing really well. Albury Wodonga, Wodonga's Victoria, Albury's New South Wales. But again, from a really low price point over the last 10 years, people have and continue to migrate to that area, and pretty well because they've got two of everything. You know, they've got two sets of hospitals, one on each side of the border. So you look at the amenity that you look for in one area, and anyone who moves somewhere like this has got the benefit of double those amenities, just, you know, crossing over the river and there they go. So that's an example of why that area is performing particularly well. But like I said, you want multiple growth drivers. You want to look at lots of amenity, and you want minimum populations of 80,000. Terry, what are you seeing in terms of where to buy?
Look, broadly across the country, I know there continues to be strong demand for some of the cheaper capital cities, particularly Perth and Adelaide, very much flavour of the year, and I think that's continuing into 2023. Still very strong demand for good regional areas. I think Queensland's very top of mind for a lot of investors. The population data continues in terms of internal migration favours Queensland. There's the exodus to affordable lifestyle trend. There's the impact and the image created by the 2032 Olympics. It sounds like it's a long way off, but the impacts start much sooner than the actual event in terms of having to provide the infrastructure required and the jobs it creates. Queensland does provide a good supply of regional markets where affordability is strong, rental yields are high, but the prospects for growth are good, and I particularly favour places like Toowoomba, for example. I think it's a wonderful place to consider. But also, just to reiterate what you're saying about regional Victoria, we're always interested in events that have an impact, and one of the things that stands out for me that Australia in the 10 years from last year to 2023 is hosting this whole series of global sporting events, and I'm always curious, what impact does that have? There's a couple of rugby World Cups, there's a women's football World Cup, there's an Olympic Games, a Commonwealth Games. Of course, the Commonwealth Games in a couple of years' time is going to be hosted by regional Victoria. It's never happened before. The Commonwealth Games in its whole history has always been hosted by one big city, most recently Birmingham in the UK, but for the first time it's going to be actually shared by various cities throughout regional Victoria in 2026. I think this is going to have a huge impact, and it's going to give another whole piece of momentum to property markets in places like Geelong, Ballarat, Bendigo, and also the Gippsland area, which is also hosting events. So I think it's very significant. It's going to bring a lot of focus. It's going to require investment in infrastructure, not just sporting infrastructure, but also transport infrastructure, accommodation infrastructure. I think it's going to be huge for Victoria. Absolutely.
I think it's going to bring an enormous amount of economic windfall to each of those areas, in addition to the infrastructure development and employment opportunities that already exist there. Definitely.
Yeah.
So let's go back to apartments. It's really important to get it right. So I mentioned before about the apartment I bought for my client, which had the 100 square metre balcony, and it was in a really tightly held building in the city. So you can see here when it originally sold, that apartment sold off the plan, and it settled in 99, and it only cost $415,000. Now, often we see apartments that they're lucky if they hold their value. What often happens is they lose and decline value. And in a case like this, you can see the importance or the relevance of what I was saying before about a unique A-grade property that's tightly held. In this case, really, really good architecturally designed building. And when I bought it for my client in 2020, in January 1, that price had escalated significantly. So this is rare. There are probably only a handful of buildings in Melbourne where you'd be getting this kind of outcome. And that property today would be worth 1.85 to 1.95 million if my client wanted to resell it. And when I bought it, I got $40,000 worth of furniture included in the purchase. So all the furniture you see there in the pictures came with it. So make sure if you're looking at a property that's like an apartment, you want to see the history of it, because if you see the building, the values in the building declining, then that might be a little bit of a red flag. For that same client, not long after, I bought a second apartment in that same building. You can see again, unique with its own individual balcony, really nice aspect. Similar thing, you know, when it sold originally, 480,000, and I was able to buy that for 170,000, which at the time was 120k under the vendor's asking price. And today, same thing, that'd be worth, 1.8, 1.9 million, probably more actually, because of, again, it being so unique and such a tightly held building. And, these only come up once every 20 years. And these are the properties that people will pay a premium for. So that's getting it right. Getting it wrong, unfortunately, this poor gentleman bought 3 properties off the plan. So the first penthouse he bought in 2020 for 1.56 million. We did a portfolio review of it last year in November, and it indicated $1.3 million appraisal. So he's already lost $350,000 on that. He also, similarly at the same time, bought 2 penthouse apartments in Sydney for 1.78 million. And again, our appraisals showed them around the 1.35. So significant drop in money. And these high performing properties bought at the same period, as I've shown here, my clients made significant returns in that time, whereas this poor gentleman lost an enormous amount of money. And when we explained the truth of it to him and why he'd lost that kind of money, he couldn't bring himself to sell them because there was a whole lot of pride in there. And he's a very smart man, but what I notice is smart people make bad decisions when it comes to property all the time because they don't understand what's required to analyse and assess a property. He went out and did it without any support, and unfortunately, like a lot of people, is now paying the price for it. And we did explain to him that it's highly likely that those properties could continue to decline in value, but he's chosen to sit on them regardless because he just can't deal with that emotional reality of he made a bad decision and it's cost him hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars.
So, Mary, one of the things you're highlighting here is that, you can get excellent growth with apartments. And I know the dominant paradigm has always been that you get better growth houses on land, but I think that paradigm is changing. But you're highlighting the importance of selecting well. And we already have people putting comments and questions in the chat box and the Q&A panel. I do encourage you to do that. We'll get to your questions a little bit later, but there is one question there which is asking what you mean by a tightly held building you referred to a couple of times earlier.
Yeah, so like I said, in this particular building, when I bought this particular property, the owner, you can see, it was one owner only and had been held for over 20 years. So when a property is tightly held, they're usually mostly owner occupied and people buy and die there, As I said, there are 5 buildings I know of in Melbourne where that's the case. And we were just very fortunate from a timing point of view that this popped up very quickly. We jumped on it straight away. We jumped on the second one because that came up off market. And that's why my client's done incredibly well and will do well into the future holding them because it's a tightly held building and it's very rare that stock comes up in those buildings.
And we're talking about buildings, we're not talking about 30-storey buildings with 300 apartments in them. We're talking about apartment buildings with have a point of difference.
Yeah, and look, these, this has got more than 40 in it and it's probably about 10 or 12 stories high, but it's definitely not 300 or 400. I mean, some of this new stock that's in the city, it's frightening. I mean, I'd hate to think what would happen if there was a fire, if you've got to, come down 40 flights. And it's the difference between something unique versus cookie cutter. So if you've got cookie cutter, small, dingy, noisy, no amenity, you wouldn't enjoy living there. Well, chances are a tenant may not either. Yeah. So just because it's cheap or just because you can buy it at a discount doesn't mean it's good investment. Again, off the plan or brand new, you're always going to pay a developer a premium. In this case, this gentleman fell for the fact that they were called penthouses. And he got sold basically. So that's what happens, free advice is sales advice, or you can engage an advocate such as myself. Yes, you pay a fee, but it's a fee investing in expertise. And when that expertise is the difference between picking a C grade property, which averaging 3%, on a $600,000 investment will grow over those 10, 20, 30 years, by working with someone like me and buying an A grade property that averages 8%, we can see that decision and that investment alone, if you're dealing with an investment qualified expert, is worth millions of dollars in your pocket.
So the potential gain or the avoidance of substantial losses you've just illustrated is substantially more than the fee they pay to get good advice.
Yeah, and I say to people, you will pay a price except you won't know until it's too late. So if you inadvertently buy the wrong property with the wrong attributes in the wrong building, and you only get that 3%, it has cost you hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. While you haven't invested in a buyer's advocate, you also haven't invested in their expertise and their capacity to select the right property with the right attributes for growth. So don't think of it as a fee, think of it as an investment in expertise. And again, you want to do with an investment qualified buyer's advocate, because that expertise is what's going to grow, create capital growth for you in the future, just as you can see here, now worth around 1.9, and same here, now worth around 195. So that's what you're investing in. Okay. So Terry, did you want to maybe see if there are any questions anyone wants answered, or?
Well, there are questions already pouring in and comments, and I do encourage everybody watching and listening to type your questions into the chat box of the Q&A panel. Either will do, and we'll get through as many as we can. Aaron is asking, and I think would be a question near and dear to your heart, Miriam. How do you ascertain A grade, investor grade properties? What's the criteria for A grade, for example, versus a C grade property?
Oh, sorry, I'll just accidentally, let me share again. So the A grade property are the attributes that go into it being qualified as that. So what we do is look at 57 attributes across the property. We give it a rating. We look at the overall score, and providing it scores at a certain level, that's what we take into account before we would recommend it or buy it for a client.
Yeah. I think you've got a checklist, I seem to recall, and it's got a lot of, it's quite a substantial checklist. You want to tick off all those things before you're willing to recommend a property to a client.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Eldon's asking, would you advise against buying close to properties that will eventually become social housing? I'm thinking the Athletes Village or the Commonwealth Games in Geelong likely to reduce values or not. I mean, I know people are concerned about those sorts of issues. I'm not sure how much they should be.
Well, there's a perception, and sometimes perception is reality. So if you know it's going to be used for that down the track, I mean, yes, you would think that people would be vetted in terms of who goes in there, but it comes down to who the type of tenant is. If you're talking about a whole lot of widows or widowers that are going to see their last days out there, that's different to potentially a family or a group of young adults that might yahoo around. So you just have to understand that there's a risk, and you need to research the pros and cons of that decision, and then make a decision from there. But certainly when we buy, we stay away from housing commission, because you just never know who's going to be there and how long they're going to be there, and what nightmare it's going to cause, for example.
So we have a question which refers to our references to the Commonwealth Games. So do you think there'll be a property boom in Geelong thanks to the Commonwealth Games? I would say that the Commonwealth Games will be a factor. It's not going to be the only factor causing a boom in Geelong. Geelong's got a lot going for it. I think it's been a wonderful market for the past 5 or 6 years, but I think its potential to keep doing that is very strong. What do you think?
Yeah, exactly. I agree. At the end of the day, it's one factor, but you always want to look at multiple factors. So things like Commonwealth Games and those events, they're a bonus, but they're not the sole reason to buy. So you just want to make sure that all those underlying fundamentals and growth drivers and micro and macroeconomics are still there, so that you can, make an informed decision, and then the games are a bonus on top of that. That's the cream, for want of a better word.
Okay. One of our viewers is referring to rental returns and saying that they think rental returns in Melbourne are very low and unlikely to be able to cover costs, but I don't think it's necessarily the case in all types of property in Melbourne. What's your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it comes down to, obviously, covering a mortgage depends on how negatively geared you are, depends on the size of the deposit, depends on the purchase price. So everything's relative. I mean, if you don't want to be significantly out of pocket from a cash flow point of view, you don't have to spend as much money. You can have a bigger deposit, and you can maybe buy regionally versus metro, or you buy an asset type that's a little bit more affordable. But again, I talked before about cash flowing, and I talked before about making sure that you can cash flow it until there's potentially another 1 or 2 interest rate rises, but until it starts to plateau and then until it starts to decline. So anytime you invest, you always want a cash buffer in the bank, be it $5,000, $10,000 to cover situations like this where you need extra cash flow. So there's always risk attached with investing. You want to make sure that you're mitigating the risk as much as possible. And then if you don't want to be heavily negatively geared, well, then maybe you buy in an area where it's a combination of capital growth and cash flow so that, you're not so much out of pocket. But yeah, definitely the rental returns are low in Melbourne. They are starting to increase like everywhere. I was talking to an agent yesterday where he said, last year he could have easily had 20 listings on the internet. And now he's lucky if he's got 5 rental listings. I've had some of my properties come up for reletting and they've been let quite readily and quite quickly. And that's encompassed increasing the rent at the time as well. So again, what it is, where it is, tenant appeal, resale appeal will make a difference.
Yeah, I've got a question here from NJ, and I think it's a question that we can't answer, but I'd like to touch on it because I think it raises some important points. NJ says, where should I invest in New South Wales? And when I get questions like that, I say, sorry, EJ, but we really can't answer that question until we know a lot more about you, for example.
Yeah.
How do you respond to questions like that from your clients?
Yeah, look, where you should invest is totally dependent on who you are as an individual, what your budget is, what your risk profile is, what your long-term plans are, what your circumstances are now. Have you currently already invested? Do you need to diversify? You have to understand the way I approach advocacy. I have a financial planning background. We take a financial planning approach to property investing. This is why we have a lot of financial advisors refer their clients to us, because we don't just go, yeah, that's a really good suburb, let's plonk you in there. There's so much more to be taken into account. And no one should ever make blanket statements about where's a good place to invest without knowing and understanding the individual circumstances, their goals, their objectives, their position, their capacity to service debt, their out-of-pocket serviceability and so forth. So I'm with you, Terry. But hey, we offer free consultations. We've got Anjay's in New South Wales. So, if you wanted to have a free consultation with Anjay, he could maybe answer that question for you because he's based out of there.
Yeah, I mean, really, I would encourage people with questions like that to follow up and make contact with Miriam afterwards and have that initial discussion, because you really can't answer that question for a couple of reasons. We need to know a lot more about you, but also New South Wales is an incredibly large state.
Yeah.
Apart from Sydney, there's a whole range of viable options throughout regional New South Wales, but which is the best will depend on the price range you're in and a whole lot of other factors.
And the same applies to WA. I mean, someone's asked about different areas in WA, and I used to live there and I worked there as an advocate as well. But, WA is enormous. You can't necessarily compare a Perth suburb to an outlying area that's further out and almost more regional. They're different. So it's not a case of which one's better. It comes, again, back down to the client, their individual needs and the research and the data. One thing I will say to everyone, if you are going to work with an advocate, you do not want someone who's sitting on their butt behind a screen in a capital city like Sydney, who then buys interstate in Perth, sight unseen, and outsources their role to someone like a building inspector. Yeah, because those things will blow up in your face as a client and their face as an advocate, because there's so much more to understanding if a property is worth investing. And what I'm describing are lots of newbies coming into the industry. They think it's, fast, easy money. They turn around and go to the building inspector, you do the inspection for me. But a building inspector is going to look at very different things to what an advocate will look at in a property. And I can still have a building inspection come through that looks good, but still not buy that property for a variety of reasons. So buyer beware when it comes to engaging what I call fake buyer agents.
Yeah, building inspection is a certain set of eyes on a property, but it's not the only set of eyes that you need.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And a building inspection comes after you've actually walked through the property and you've looked at it and you've assessed it and you've ticked boxes and made sure that it's not compromised in any way before you then go and put an offer in or even consider doing a building and pest inspection.
Okay. So one of those questions you referred to about Perth is asking about Clarkson and Butler versus Rockingham. Clarkson and Butler in the far north of the Perth metro area in the local government area of Wanneroo, very much a new development area, a place of new housing estates. Rockingham's in the south My preference is for Rockingham. I think there's more action in Perth in the south. There's more major employment nodes, very big ones, including the Perth airport. It's not to say that investment in the north doesn't have validity, but it is a place where lots of new estates have been created, whole new suburbs have been created, and that tends to bring a lot of new supply. And there can be periods of oversupply when the development industry doesn't get that right. So you need to be very careful about when you invest in areas like that. Rockingham's more established, close to big employment nodes, affordable bayside living. It's a place I do like in the Perth metropolitan area. It's not for everybody at all, very much, as we referred to earlier. It does depend on the individual circumstances as to whether that is a good place to consider.
Well, that's right. And again, if you're going to be buying there, you want to make sure that your advocate's physically on the ground looking at it and not palming it off to someone else to do their job for them. Someone is making the comment about apartments with ever increasing strata fees, and I don't disagree. You know, some of the strata fees nowadays are horrific. Certainly there are properties where, you know, like this one, they can be $10,000, $15,000, even $20,000 a year. Downsizers will factor those costs in. That's just the cost of buying in those properties. And again, you'd only want to be buying in those high quality properties where they're getting really good returns, they're getting good, strong interest if they rent it. They might even choose to Airbnb it, or that just might be their lock up and leave. So yes, there's potential for headaches, but you have to do your research on the property before you buy it. You've got to go through your meeting minutes, and then you've got to make an informed decision as if you want to buy that property. You don't want to be buying a poor quality apartment building with structural cracks. That's up to you to do the due diligence on it before you even go down that path. You know, I was looking for a home buyer recently. We had a budget of 1.3 million. We came across an amazing property, literally just 50 metres down the road from where I am. It had fantastic views over Albert Park Lake and the ocean. But there are combustible cladding issues that need to be attended. It was an extra $8,000 special levy per owner. And then there was no guarantee that that was necessarily going to fix the issue. So we walked away and we bought a different property. So it's up to you to do that due diligence, or your advocate if you're engaging an advocate.
Yeah, there's a lot to consider, but they're important considerations. It's worth taking the time and spending the money to get it right, rather than end up with find out too late that you've got something that's going to cost you a lot of money or won't grow in value. We have a question. Do you think the Victorian state government holding the largest debt amongst the states will have an effect on property values in Victoria? What do you think?
You really shouldn't talk to me, get me to talk about the Victorian state government.
Yeah, look, I really don't
shake my head.
Yeah, look, yeah, and you've probably got all sorts of really good reasons for that, but look, I think sometimes property investors sort of look too hard for things to worry about. I don't think the fact that the state government of Victoria has a high level of debt is going to impact on property values. Lots of other factors play into whether property values in a particular area are going to rise or not. And I don't think the level of government debt in Victoria is going to be a factor.
And look, there are plenty of other states to invest in if that's a concern for you. I mean, whatever you do, you need to sleep at night. And again, you want to make sure you've got a strategy and your risk profile matches that strategy so you can sleep at night. Hence, you know, understand all of that before you go out and buy.
Yeah. Butlinda, what do you think of sales agents that bring an advocate through for vendors? I'm not sure what that means.
Yeah, look, I don't like that. If they don't have the listing and they use an advocate to try and secure the listing.
Right. Okay.
You know, people do it. Some people do it. Some people don't. Sometimes they do it because the vendor's expectation of price is way out of line with the reality, and they bring an independent advocate through to give them their opinion, or they might bring an advocate through to see if they've got a client who wants to buy it. There are different reasons why they do it. Generally, if I have someone who's telling me that there's a property that I can come and have a look at, I always ask the question if they've got a listing on it, because if they don't, they're just wasting my time and I'm not interested. Yeah.
Okay. Now Jim's asking about the outlook for Sydney apartments close to the CBD. Look, I see trends in the Sydney apartment market which are similar to the ones that Miriam's describing for Melbourne. There is definitely an uplift in demand in those areas that are well located, close to the centre of the city, but where houses are very expensive and beyond the reach of many buyers, but apartments are a lot more affordable, provided you're buying the right apartment in the right location. I think there's evidence that market is becoming much stronger. I think it's a trend, absolutely.
Yeah. And, you've got sophisticated buyers who are willing to spend millions on those types of properties because it's lifestyle, lock up and leave, don't have to worry about it. They can cash flow and afford the owner's court fees. And, that's their, until I die property. Literally, for some of them it is, they may never go into any kind of retirement living. They may choose that as an alternate to retirement living. And, if you've got someone in their 50s or 60, who's still got 20, 30 years ahead of them, and they've got lifts and they've got facilities in terms of ease of access into the property, and they don't need to worry about stairs and those sorts of things, they become, often the last property that person's going to buy, hence the buy and hold, and why properties are tightly held for as long as they are, if they're, exceptional.
Okay. Look, we've still got about 10 minutes to go before we get to the hour in the broadcast. Anybody else out there with any questions or comments, now's the time. It's a great opportunity to pick the brains of a couple of people who have been in the industry for a long time, lots of knowledge and experience, so don't waste that opportunity. Remember, just while we're waiting for some more questions perhaps to come through, I just want to touch on something a comment you made right at the start of your broadcast, and that was to do with the sort of forecasting we're getting from certain sources at the moment of what's going to happen on property markets. The thing I want to point out to people is always perhaps do a little bit of a deep dive into the track record of the people making a forecast. And I would point out to you that, because we've done that deep dive many times, and what I can tell you is that the people with the worst forecasting track record on property prices in Australia are actually the economists who work for the big four banks. Yeah. Now, you might think that they're the people with the qualifications to get it right, but no, they get it wrong constantly. That most of them are now forecasting price decline this year. I think they'll be proven wrong again, as they were in 2020 when COVID struck, and they were all forecasting prices to drop 15, 20%. The Commonwealth Bank said in their worst case scenario, 33%. And we actually had prices rising by the end of 2020 and to a notable property boom in 2021. They didn't see it coming. They're just not very good at it. And
well, hey, how about the Reserve Bank governor? I mean, if someone should be sacked for making the most ridiculous statement on earth and not being held to account, that's him. Interest rates aren't going to rise until 2024. I mean, disgraceful.
I totally agree. I think he should resign or be sacked. He misled the whole nation. So many people took him at his word. He repeated it so many times that we all believed it. And now, not only has he contradicted his own forecast, but he has far too aggressively lifted interest rates. And I think he's overreaching, and he's inflicting pain unnecessarily on all Australian households, not just those that have mortgages, but people who pay rent are also impacted by this.
Well, this is it. I mean, people think that it's only first home buyers that are going to suffer interest rate rises, but it's not. You've got people in all sorts of demographics and locations and suburbs, whether they're first home buyers or investors. People still have mortgages. They might not be huge, but they still have mortgages, and those mortgage repayments are doubling, and that affects everybody's lifestyle. So it's just an abomination that he's still holding that position, and the government haven't come in and taken him out of his role, which they quite frankly should have. You've got to remember, you've got media who love the grabs and the sensationalistic headlines, who are always going to churn stuff out. But if you can hold your nerve and just remember that properties work in cycles, they go up, they plateau, they might come down a little bit, they go up, they plateau. So over the last 30 years, that's a pretty typical trend that we've seen. So if you can just hold your nerve, we're always sure you've got that buffer of money available to cash flow things like this, and ride this particular cycle, because it is another cycle, then, you should be able to hold yourself in good stead.
And Karen's asking, is land tax an issue with the legal entity ownership planning, land tax minimisation planning? Certainly a consideration that people to keep in mind.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, different states have got different levels of land tax, and whether you buy in your own individual name versus an entity can impact the amount of land tax that you have. And this is perpetually, local governments and the tax office trying to penalise people to not so much evade tax, but minimise tax. And, it's really stupid because they're perpetually describing landlords as villains and evil, yet were it not for the landlords in this country providing investment properties and rental properties for people to live in, the situation will be far worse than it currently is. So we've got a government that perpetually demonises landlords. We've got a media that plays that same game of demonisation. And, the harder they make it for people to invest, the more rules, regulations, penalties, fees, taxes, Victoria's a ripper for that, that they bring in, the less incentive it's going to be for people to want to invest, and the worse this crisis of sufficient rental accommodation is going to take.
And you've just described why we have a rental shortage crisis in Australia.
Well, certainly, I'll say during COVID, when the 14 minimum standards came in, there were properties that simply would have cost tens of thousands of dollars for them to be upgraded. A lot of older people who held those assets and they were generating their income in addition to their pension, or instead of, were forced to sell those properties because they couldn't cash flow any renovations. Those properties were taken up mostly by home buyers at the time. And so the rental supply just drastically diminished. And then, the whole home building palaver that the government threw out there for their 5-second media grab so they could self-congratulate themselves, caused issues in terms of building and construction. And can I say, there are probably still 10,000 Department of Housing homes in Victoria that are sitting vacant because we have year after year incompetent governments that do not invest the money into repairing those properties to make them habitable. They'd rather make an announcement going, hey, we're going to build, $100 million worth of apartments, 25 apartments later, instead of the thousands of Department of Housing properties that are sitting vacant that they're doing absolutely nothing about.
Yes, well, I'm a firm believer that all the major issues that currently afflict the housing market, whether it's the rental shortage, the affordability problem, or builders going broke and new housing costing a lot of money, is all laid at the feet of our politicians. And they're very good at pointing the finger of blame at others, but really it all comes down to the politicians. We deserve better. We've got an attendee asking, do you think the South Australian market has peaked? Has it had its day in the sun? I would say no. I think Adelaide has still got plenty of upside. It's really at the beginning of a cycle rather than at the end of it. South Australia is a rising economy. That's the key factor. And Adelaide's becoming a more important city, which offers affordability and lifestyle. And that's the thing that people are looking for. So I think there's more to go for that market. Do you have any views on that one, Miriam?
Look, I don't forecast peaks and troughs where we're at in the market, because I don't have a crystal ball, and I don't buy with a short-term perspective in terms of timing the market for my clients to renovate, flip and sell. So we take a medium to long-term approach. And whilst timing doesn't hurt, it's more about time in the market and letting the market do its thing. And I'm yet to see a client or a prospect who can ever pick the end of the market. And by the time they've picked it, it's already started going up again and they've missed their window, which is pretty common. That happens as well. Yeah.
I think far too many people make that mistake trying to, time the market. I think, it's a cliche, but time in the market is more important than timing the market.
Yeah. As
they say, no one rings a bell when the bottom is reached. By the time the media is telling you about it, it's probably 6 months too late.
Yeah.
If you're ready to go, provided you're buying sensibly in a good area, go. Don't wait for the market to be optimum, because there's no way you can get that right. You may get lucky, but you certainly can't time it through a planned process.
Yeah, and I say the time to buy is when the bank gives you money, because it doesn't matter what's going on in the market. If you don't qualify for a loan, you'll never get your foot in the door. So just to wind up, I just want to let you know that we do have free resources available to you. So you can see here on the screen, you've got a little hamburger drop down there. So if you click on that, you'll be able to look at my best-selling book. You can download some property buyers guides. We've got blogs to have a look at as well. So certainly there's a blog there about someone doing it cheaper, but ostensibly the cost of that, price and cost are two different things. The rise of fake buyer agents, please read that. There are 17 points on that. that you should have a look at as to how these fake buyer agents are just spreading themselves around the country. And the example I gave of someone buying a property in Perth, sight unseen, in that instance, the building report was clean, but I know for a fact that the property's gone unconditional. And in that instance, the property manager went in, spoke to the tenant. There's a whole lot of flooding that didn't get picked up in the building inspection. And now, you know, you've got someone who's bought a property that they never ran their eyes over. They never spoke to the tenant. They never physically inspected it, and they bought their client a lemon. So,
yeah, I think it's one of the great dangers at the moment. It seems to be a point of view out there that calling yourself a buyer's agent is a really easy way to make lots of money. And of course, it's not, it's hard work, and you do need expertise. I'm encountering far too many people calling themselves buyer's agents who actually don't know anything more than the person they're representing. So what possibly do you offer? Why would someone pay you a fee?
Yeah. Well, there's no value delivery. They've got a sharp pitch. They get people over the line because someone's given them the script that's, you know, great at converting, but then they're lost wandering around, bumbling about going, what do I do now? Anyway, we are recruiting. So for people who are experienced advocate, experienced selling agents who want to transition, no newbies, no one who's done it before, no one who's overpaid for some $8,000 rubbish course and can't make a living. But if you are generally experienced in the industry as a buyer's agent or selling agent, we're interested in having a chat with you. We're recruiting nationally, so you can just jump on our franchise page and yeah, click on the application. We'll have a chat with you from there. Certainly, we are in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and the regional markets. As I said, we work with home buyers, upgraders, downsizers, and investors. And if anyone wants to reach out and contact me, feel free to do so. Those are my details on the screen.
Okay, thank you, Miriam. Look, we got through a lot of the questions, but there was a big rush of questions at the end, and we didn't get through all of those. But if you would like to have your question answered or just have a general discussion, in the first instance, with Miriam, I urge you to make contact, and it doesn't cost anything to have that initial chat and talk about your circumstances and how an organisation like Property Maintenance might be able to help you. Thanks, Miriam.
And particularly if you go on the free consultation page, you can click the area that you're interested in as well, and we'll put you in touch with a local maven in that area.
Okay, Miriam, a great way to start the webinar season for 2023. It's been a great discussion, a great presentation, lots of great information for a very good, strong audience. And everyone who registered for the event will get a recording, so you can watch it again, or if you weren't able to attend live, you can watch it at your leisure. Please, I do urge you to follow up if you have further questions or need for a good advocate on your team. I think it's money well spent. Thank you, Miriam. Let's do it again soon.
Thank you, Terry. That was great. And thank you, everyone, very much for your allocating your time today to join us on the webinar. Have a great week.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.